All right, Ivanka Trump thought she was untouchable. For years, she had kept her name spotless while everything around her family turned to ash. She built a brand so carefully, so deliberately, so surgically separated from the chaos that bore her last name that even her father's most devoted critics gave her a reluctant pass. Right now, something happened inside a Manhattan courtroom that shattered that image in a single hour. One document, one question, one moment of silence that lasted 4 seconds and felt like 4 years. What happened between the polished public persona and that frozen courtroom moment is the story nobody is telling completely. Because this isn't about politics. This isn't about which family member you like more or less. This is about a prosecutor who spent years building a paper trail and walked into that room with something Ivanka's legal team never fully anticipated. And when you see what that document actually showed, you'll understand why the most carefully protected name in the Trump empire is now sitting in the middle of a legal fire she can't simply walk away from. So what pushed this moment over the edge? One email, one response, one line Ivanka should never have put in writing. She engaged directly with the numbers. Not occasionally, not accidentally. Specifically and substantively. But here's the thing. This wasn't random. This was years of prosecutors quietly assembling a documentary architecture, finally stepping into the open. And I'm going to show you exactly how that single hour unfolded and why nothing about it will ever fully go away. Here's what actually happened the moment everyone clicked to see. The courtroom on that morning looked ordinary from the outside. Reporters filled the gallery. Lawyers arranged their notes. The bailiff called for order. And then she walked in. Ivanka Trump, composed as always, wearing a dark blazer, moving with the kind of deliberate calm that only comes from intensive preparation or from genuine confidence. Maybe both. But the prosecutors weren't calm. They had something. The questioning started predictably enough. Background questions. Her role at the Trump Organization. Her timeline of involvement, standard foundation laying that anyone who has watched a trial knows is just the runway before the plane actually takes off. Then it shifted. The lead prosecutor placed a document on the screen. A financial statement. Not generic, not summarized, a specific communication with Ivanka's name attached, related to one of the properties at the center of the fraud allegations. The document showed internal discussions about property valuations, the kind of back and forth between executives that usually stays buried in corporate archives unless someone with a subpoena goes digging. Ivanka looked at it. The courtroom looked at her. And then came the question that froze everything. Did you review this document before it was submitted to lenders? The silence that followed lasted maybe 4 seconds. In a Manhattan courtroom with 50 reporters in the room, 4 seconds is an eternity. Nobody expected this to happen so fast. For months, legal analysts had been saying Ivanka's involvement would be peripheral, tangential, that prosecutors would use her as background texture, not as a central figure. She had already won an earlier legal battle to avoid testifying in a different phase of proceedings. She had attorneys who knew how to navigate these waters. She was, by most accounts, the Trump family member who had managed to keep the most distance between herself and the legal fallout. That calculation collapsed in that room. Because what prosecutors revealed wasn't just one document. It was a sequence of documents, communications spanning years, showing not an executive who was kept in the dark about how numbers were being presented to financial institutions, but one who was actively in the loop. Emails, internal memos, review cycles, the paper trail that her lawyers had apparently not fully anticipated being surfaced in that particular way on that particular morning. One legal analyst watching the proceedings from outside said it plainly. She came in to answer questions about what she knew. She ended up facing questions about what she did. That's a completely different situation. And it was the doing that made the courtroom freeze. Here's the background you need, because this moment didn't arrive in a vacuum. When the New York Attorney General's civil fraud case began building its full evidentiary record, Ivanka Trump was not initially named as a defendant. That was a critical distinction that her legal team had fought for and won. She was a witness, not a party to the action. That status carries enormous practical difference. Defendants face liability, witnesses face questions, and witnesses can prepare within limits for the questions they expect to face. But witnesses can also be surprised. What the AG's office had assembled over years of investigation was a documentary record of how the Trump Organization operated its financial reporting apparatus. Who saw what? Who approved what? Who received the final numbers before those numbers went out to the institutions that made billion-dollar lending decisions based on them? Ivanka Trump served as executive vice president of the Trump Organization for years. She wasn't in the background. She was, by any reasonable definition, part of the senior leadership structure that produced the documents prosecutors were challenging as fraudulent. Her name appeared in communications. Her approvals appeared in review chains. Her role wasn't decorative. Former colleagues have said, carefully and off the record, that she was known inside the organization as someone who actually read what she signed. Unlike some executives who rubber-stamp documents for efficiency, she was the type who asked follow-up questions, who wanted to understand the rationale behind numbers before putting her name near them. That reputation, built over years as a sign of her competence and seriousness, was now cutting in a completely different direction. So what exactly is this case built on, and why does her testimony matter so specifically? At the heart of the New York fraud case is a simple but devastating allegation. The Trump Organization routinely submitted financial statements to banks, lenders, and insurers that dramatically overstated the value of its assets. Properties were listed at values that bore almost no relationship to their independently assessed worth. Golf clubs were counted using assumptions that no legitimate appraiser would accept. Residential properties were listed at square footages that didn't match their actual dimensions. The legal question was never really whether the numbers were inflated. Even the defense acknowledged that the figures were aggressive. The legal question was whether the inflation was intentional, systematic, and designed to deceive. That's where testimony from someone inside the organization becomes essential. If you can show that senior executives reviewed these financial statements, understood the methodology behind them, and sent them out anyway, knowing that the valuations were inflated beyond anything defensible, then you've established the intent component that makes fraud and not just sloppy accounting. Ivanka Trump, as a senior executive who sat in the rooms where these decisions were made and whose name appears in the document trails prosecutors are relying on, is not just a peripheral character in that story. She is potentially one of the most important witnesses to the question of what the leadership of the Trump Organization actually knew. And that is why what happened in that final hour mattered so much to everyone in that room. Here's where the tension became something else entirely. When Ivanka paused before answering that question about the document, her lawyer leaned in. The objection that followed was technical, procedural, the kind of thing lawyers are trained to throw up as a speed bump when their client needs a breath. The judge considered it briefly and overruled it. She had to answer. What she said in the next 60 seconds is being analyzed by every attorney, every political observer, and every journalist who was in that room or has since read the transcript, because her answer threaded a needle that most people in her position couldn't have threaded. She acknowledged the document. She acknowledged having seen communications in that general period, but she framed her recollection in terms that preserved ambiguity about the specific decisions that the prosecutors most needed to pin down. It wasn't a denial. It wasn't a confession. It was the kind of precision that years of legal preparation produces. But here's what prosecutors did next that changed the energy in the room again. They put up a second document. This one was an email. And this email showed a response, not just a review, not just a receipt, but an actual response where Ivanka's account had replied to a communication about the financial statement preparation process, with substantive commentary about the numbers. The courtroom went very still. Because a person who reviews a document can claim limited engagement, a person who replies to a communication with substantive commentary about the numbers in that document has a much harder time maintaining that they didn't understand what those numbers represented or how they were being used. Her lawyer was on his feet again immediately. The judge let the document in. This is the part of the story that most coverage is handling wrong, and you need to understand why. The immediate reaction from Trump's political world was predictable. Attacks on the prosecution, claims of political targeting, the familiar language of persecution that now automatically surrounds any legal action involving this family. And some of those attacks have substance, at least on the margins. Letitia James did campaign on investigating the Trump Organization. That is a fact that defense attorneys have emphasized at every stage of these proceedings. But here's the thing about that argument. The documents don't care about campaign promises. The emails don't care about political motivations. The question of whether those financial statements were fraudulent is answered by the financial statements themselves, by what they claimed versus what independent appraisers and assessors found, and by the internal communications that show who in the organization knew what the real numbers were. Ivanka Trump's testimony matters because she is a witness to that internal knowledge question. Not because of who her father is, not because of what she believes politically, not because prosecutors wanted to embarrass the family. She is a witness because her name is in the documents. That distinction is important because there are people who will use her appearance in that courtroom as evidence of a witch hunt, and there are people who will use it as proof of guilt by association. And both of those reactions miss the specific, granular, document-based question that her testimony was actually being used to address. Let's talk about what this actually cost her, because the personal dimension here is something nobody is being fully honest about. Ivanka Trump spent years building a deliberate distance from the most combustible aspects of her father's public life. After leaving the White House, she made a calculated decision to step back from political involvement. She moved to Florida. She focused on her family, on her business interests, on the kind of quiet life that is the polar opposite of the chaos that continues to swirl around her father's political and legal battles. That choice, whether you respect it or find it convenient, represented a genuine attempt to build a separate identity from the Trump organization and its controversies. Walking into that courtroom erased a significant portion of that effort. Every camera in New York was outside that building. Every headline the next morning had her name in it. The carefully maintained distance, the years of deliberate positioning as the family member who had moved on, compressed in a single morning into something she could no longer control. People close to her have described the period leading up to her testimony as one of the most stressful of her life. Not because she was afraid of what she had done, according to these accounts, but because she understood what it would mean to be in that room under oath, with cameras outside and the weight of a fraud case pressing down on every word. She prepared intensively. Her legal team ran her through every possible question, every possible document, every possible angle of attack. She knew what was coming, or thought she did. And then prosecutors put up that email. Here's what the legal community is now quietly debating, and it matters more than the political noise. Civil cases like this one operate on different standards than criminal proceedings. The evidentiary threshold is lower. The inferences that a judge or jury can draw are broader. And the consequences, while they don't include prison time, can include financial liability that changes lives. Ivanka is not a defendant in this case, but her testimony can still have profound consequences for the defendants who are her family members. And here's where it gets genuinely complicated. If her testimony under oath conflicts with documents that prosecutors have already entered into evidence, that creates legal exposure of its own. If her testimony supports the prosecution's narrative about internal knowledge of inflated values, it damages the defense case for Donald Trump and her brothers. If she attempts to protect them and the documentary record contradicts her, she faces potential perjury exposure. There is no clean path through this room for her. One defense attorney who has handled high-profile civil cases and who has no connection to this matter explained it this way. The worst position to be in as a witness is when the documentary record already tells a story, and you have to decide whether to confirm it, contradict it, or thread some needle in between. Each of those choices carries its own risk. That is the position Ivanka Trump found herself in during that final hour. And the choice she made, the precise, careful, ambiguity-preserving testimony she delivered, is going to be studied by lawyers for years as an example of how to survive a difficult witness situation. Whether it ultimately helped or hurt the defendants she cares about is still being determined. Now, here's where the story gets bigger than one courtroom. And this is the part that should make everyone uncomfortable, regardless of politics. What happened with Ivanka's testimony is a window into something that has been building for decades inside American corporate culture. The use of financial statements as flexible documents, as tools of impression management rather than precise records of reality, is not unique to the Trump organization. Any honest banker, any honest real estate professional, any honest commercial lender will tell you that aggressive valuation practices have been standard operating procedure in certain sectors of the American economy for generations. The Trump case is extreme. The gap between claimed values and assessed values in the documents at the center of this case goes beyond aggressive into territory that prosecutors successfully labeled fraudulent. but the underlying practice of presenting the most favorable possible picture in financial disclosures exists at scale across multiple industries. What this case, and specifically what the moment when Ivanka Trump sat in that witness chair, represents, is a reckoning with the question of who is responsible for that practice and what accountability actually looks like. She didn't run the organization alone. She didn't create the valuation methodology. She didn't design the financial statement format or decide which numbers went to which lenders, but she was an executive in the organization. She was in the communications chains. She was close enough to the process that prosecutors thought her testimony was worth fighting for. And that's the uncomfortable truth at the center of this story. Corporate executives who are present but not primary, who are informed but not directing, who benefit from practices without designing them. Those people have historically been protected by the complexity of organizational hierarchy. The question this case forces is whether that protection is legitimate or whether it is itself a form of fraud. Here's what nobody in the political coverage wants to acknowledge. Ivanka Trump's composure in that courtroom was by any objective account remarkable. She answered questions without breaking. She navigated hostile examination without the kind of defensive outbursts that characterized her father's testimony in earlier proceedings. She was, by the accounts of people in that room, prepared and controlled in a way that demonstrated genuine professionalism under pressure. That doesn't determine legal outcomes. That doesn't tell you whether her answers helped or hurt, but it matters because it reframes the narrative that her critics were hoping the day would deliver. People who wanted to see a collapse didn't get one. People who wanted to see defiance got precision instead. The drama that the cameras were assembled outside to capture manifested in something quieter and in some ways more consequential. A senior executive of a major organization, under oath, in the middle of a fraud case, carefully navigating a documentary record that prosecutors had spent years assembling. That is not a spectacle. That is a legal proceeding with real consequences. If this case ultimately produces findings that motivate additional inquiry into related practices, those communications involving Ivanka Trump are part of the starting foundation. The law is a long game. Cases like this one take years to resolve fully. What looks like a single dramatic morning in a courtroom is actually a data point in a process that will unfold over timeframes that none of us can fully anticipate. And Ivanka Trump knows that, her lawyers know it, the prosecutors know it. Everyone in that room understood that what happened in those few hours was not a conclusion. It was a layer added to a foundation that keeps getting deeper. The question everyone is asking right now is simple. Did she help her family or hurt them? The honest answer is that nobody knows yet. The testimony was careful enough that it doesn't obviously damage the defendants who matter most to her. It was not a moment of sudden revelation that blew the defense case open. Prosecutors got what they needed to establish her presence in the process, her awareness of communications, her proximity to the decisions at issue. Whether that proximity is enough to strengthen the overall fraud findings against the defendants, whether the appellate courts will look at the full record, including her testimony, and find it compelling, whether the documentary evidence she acknowledged seeing will ultimately become a foundation stone in upholding or overturning the existing rulings, none of that is determined yet. What is determined is that the final hour in that courtroom was not what anyone predicted. But here's what's bothering me, and I want to be direct about it. Ivanka Trump's appearance in that courtroom has been framed by her father's political apparatus as evidence of persecution. One more member of the family being dragged in front of cameras to satisfy political enemies. And that framing will resonate with people who already believe it. But the documents she was asked about are not political. The email that froze the courtroom is not a piece of political opposition research. It is a corporate communication that allegedly shows awareness of the methodology behind financial statements that prosecutors have already proven were fraudulent. There is a version of this story where Ivanka Trump is a tragic figure, someone caught in the gravitational pull of a family business and a family patriarch whose practices she didn't design and couldn't control. That version might be partially true. There is also a version where she was a senior executive who understood what she was part of and made choices that are now subject to legal scrutiny. That version is also potentially true. Both of those things can be true at the same time. And the discomfort of that simultaneous truth is something that the loudest voices on both sides of this story refuse to sit with. She is neither a martyr nor a villain in a clean narrative. She is a person in the middle of a legal proceeding with real consequences, trying to navigate a documentary record that doesn't give her the distance from these events that she spent years trying to create. Here's where things stand right now. Her testimony is complete. The transcript will be released. Legal analysts will spend weeks dissecting every answer, every pause, every document that was introduced, and every objection that was sustained or overruled. The main fraud case continues its appellate journey, now carrying Ivanka's words as part of its expanding record. Trump Organization executives are watching every development. Banks that have already distanced themselves from the organization are watching. Potential future partners are watching. The brand that once carried an automatic premium is navigating territory that has no map. Ivanka's personal legal exposure in this proceeding remains as a witness, not a defendant. But witnesses in cases with this much documentary evidence exist in a complicated space where the distinction between testifying about what happened and being implicated in what happened can become blurry with time and additional inquiry. Watch the next 60 days. The appellate schedule in the main fraud case is moving. Prosecutors are not finished building their record, and the documents introduced during that final hour of testimony are now in a file that won't go away. There's something that's not in any official report that I want you to sit with. And the moment that froze the courtroom, that 4 seconds of silence after the prosecutor asked whether she reviewed the document before it went to lenders, that moment was not just legally significant, it was humanly significant. Because in that pause, you could see what this entire case is actually about. It's about what people in positions of power and proximity do with their knowledge. It's about the gap between what executives know and what they say they know. It's about whether being inside a system that does something wrong while not being the architect of that wrong is enough to create accountability, or enough to create legal exposure, or enough to create something harder to define and harder to escape, which is culpability. Ivanka Trump sat in that chair representing, whether she wanted to or not, every corporate executive who has ever been in a room where something was happening, who understood it well enough to comment on it, and who has spent years since hoping that their proximity doesn't become their liability. The 4 seconds of silence before her answer is going to echo longer than any words she said. And here's what keeps me coming back to this story. Trump is still fighting. The appeals are still pending. The financial penalty is still being challenged. The broader case is still moving. And every new development, every new ruling, every new testimony draws more of the family into a proceeding that started as a civil fraud case and has become something that feels like an accounting for decades of a particular way of doing business. Ivanka did not collapse in that room. She was controlled and prepared and precise. But something still broke loose in that courtroom when that email went up on the screen, when the judge overruled the objection, when she had to acknowledge that the communication was real and that she had been part of it. Whatever she thought walking in, she walked out knowing that the distance she spent years building is gone. The case is not over. The appeals are not over. The legal battle surrounding this family will extend for years into a future that nobody can fully predict. But that final hour, that frozen moment, that 4 seconds of silence in a Manhattan courtroom, that is already part of the permanent record. And trust me, what comes from that record next is going to be bigger and more consequential than anything that happened today. The question is whether you'll be watching when it lands.